listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96. We have just completed the Jazz Zone with T in Providence, and joining us on the line, Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne is an African historian who holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, and he has been a mainstay on this with our show for many for decades, and he covers everything from Hank Aaron to Shaka and the Zulus. How are you doing today, sir?
It's all good. What about you? And fortunately, I've recovered from the brief illness that caused me to abort our interview last Sunday. So thank goodness for that.
That is definitely good news. No, I was thinking about you the other day. I've been listening to this. I've been listening to him for quite a while. There's a young man by the name of Catfish Ingram, a young guy. I don't know. He might be 20. I don't even think he's 25 years old, but he's carrying the blues tradition on. He's from Clarksdale, Mississippi. Great singer, great guitarist. And what do you think about him?
Oh, it's news to me.
Oh, you should check him out. He can out Jimi Hendrix, and he can out Jimmy Reed. No, he's a bad mama jammer. Young guy.
Oh, right on.
Young, very. He's good. I know you love him.
Well, I'm a former blues
Melinda, you
singer myself.
Yeah, let's start because.
I wanted to ask you. This is Black Music Month, and I wanted to ask you before Melinda starts. How do you rate Percy Mayfield as a singer and a songwriter and as a philosopher?
Well, I know that he's one of your favorites, so I would not dare to contradict you. I would only seek to embellish and enhance what you've already articulated about this man from Louisiana. And I should say that the blemish on his record, if I'm not mistaken, was his breaking the cultural boycott against South Africa. I recall.
No. That was Curtis, not Percy. Not Percy never went to South Africa. That was Curtis.
Are you sure?
Positive.
Okay.
Positive.
When I was living in Zimbabwe, I somewhat remember him being very popular there and actually performing. And I'm doing a search now, and apparently, anyway, you might want to double check that.
Okay, yeah, Percy is from Minden, Louisiana, and like he is the reason why I'm so what's the word, fanatic about him is because he was born in Minden, which is in Lincoln Parish, and I was born in Arcadia, Louisiana, which is in Bienville Parish. And all of my parents and all of my aunts and uncles were born in Lincoln Parish, and you couldn't go into anybody in the Gibson or the Richmond house and say anything bad about Percy Mayfield, because you might get you might not get any food that night,
Oh, I understand.
But let's Melinda, you can kick it off.
Yeah, let's get into the China-Arab summit.
Say that again?
The China-Arab summit.
Oh, sorry about that. Well, there have been a number of high-level summits featuring Asian economies or Asian nations and nations from Africa and the Arab world. Now, with regard to what you've articulated, what was important in the short term about the China-Arab Summit was that President Xi Jinping outlined a proposal to resolve the conflict in Gaza, and the fact that the president of Egypt was present, President al-Sisi gave heft and weight to his remarks, particularly since, given the ongoing Israeli offensive in Rafah, abutting the border with Egypt, there is a real danger of a sharper conflict emerging between Egypt and Israel, which could wholly upset their decades-long so-called peace treaty. Staying on that particular front, I should also mention something else that was quite remarkable this past week, which is that the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, founded in 1909, 3 years before the African National Congress in 1912, the organization that capitulated to anti-communism when the Red Scare was launched post-World War II, post-1945, in a rare maneuver, criticized Israel and called for a ceasefire and made remarks about U.S. shipping military materiel to Israel. Now, even the New York Times was struck by the fact that the NAACP spoke out on this issue because, as the Times noted, they're notorious for ignoring foreign affairs. It's almost as if they're ignoring the fires that are slowly spreading around the world to North America. And their line is basically that, well, we'll deal with the fire once it reaches our backyard. Before that, we have nothing to say. And so this was quite remarkable. And also remarkable is that I've been looking for attacks on the NAACP from the right wing, because the right wing has been notorious for attacking particularly Black people who speak out on this question. It was just revealed that the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs in Israel has been targeting Black elected officials in a social media campaign to try to influence them, and has not been unsuccessful. I should also mention that a primary target who has totally surrendered to the Israeli lobby is the Afro-Latin congressman from the South Bronx, Richie Torres, who is more Zionist than certain members of the Zionist lobby, which is ironic since he hails from and represents what is probably the poorest congressional district in the United States of America. And so this China-Arab summit, which we have begun discussing, inevitably has led us into these other issues because they're all interconnected.
You're listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96. Have you exhausted that, or can we move to the NAACP? I'm sorry, I'm very discombobulated today. You know, with the the NAACP's record is became shaky, like you said. But how do you deal with the fact that they had people like Medgar Evers, who was a giant in the African liberation struggle, and they also had Robert F. Williams, and who wrote Negroes with Guns, and Mr. Dr. Du Bois was a member of the NAACP. Could you talk about the struggles that they had trying to keep the NAACP on the right side of history?
Well, as you know, the latter two, Du Bois and Robert F. Williams, eventually defected or were ousted from the NAACP, whereas Medgar Evers was shot by the right wing in the driveway of his home in Mississippi. So I guess you could say he did not live long enough to come to a fork in the road with NAACP. I have to say, I'm quite critical of that organization because I don't think it's lived up to its mandate, it's not lived up to its charter. And that has been a bane to the existence of Black people, a bane to the existence of a progressive movement in this country. And let us only hope that their speaking out on the current crisis in historic Palestine is simply a harbinger of speaking out on other issues. For example, the embargo against Cuba, For example, U.S. heightening tensions with China and Russia. Indeed, one of the points I would like to stress this afternoon is that according to sober-minded analysts, the small planet on which we reside might be closer to nuclear holocaust at any time since the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. This is a direct result of the United States saber rattling, providing Ukraine with weapons through which they can attack Russia in Russian territory. President Putin has made it clear that this will not go unanswered. And in that regard, note that there has been and is ongoing a visit by a major Russian flotilla to Cuba, 90 miles off the shores of Florida. Keep in mind as well that the United States is still threatening China. In fact, during my brief illness, I had quite a bit of time to listen to lectures. And one that stuck in my mind was by the nuclear physicist Ted Postol, P-O-S-T-O-L, who also studies the Allied question of nuclear war, and mentioned in one of his lectures that if the United States is not careful in its jousting with China in the South China Sea, there will be events that will be the most significant and profound for the people of North America since 1776. That's what he said. So this is a very dire moment. And to think that the NAACP has been asleep at the switch while the planet is hurtling towards possible extinction, that's nonfeasance, misfeasance, and malfeasance of the highest order, or should I say the lowest order.
Not funny, but the way you delivered it was funny. But how do you account for the fact that the progressive or revolutionary governments in francophones, in quote, West Africa, have been talking about the fact that Russia is on the right side of at this moment on the right side of history, and some of our skin nationalists from the United States are basically, they're either saying that beware of the Russians, or we don't have a horse in the race. How do you deal with that question?
Well, I dealt with that in an interview on Sputnik just this week that you can now find on the Activist News Network. And to reduce a complex question, what I basically said is that Russia is not conflicted. It does not have a conflict of interest, unlike the United States and the North Atlantic countries, when it comes to combating religious zealotry. What I mean is, if you look at the Sahel nations, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, perhaps even Chad, if you look at even Benin, Nigeria with Boko Haram in the north, if you look at Central African Republic, you'll see these so-called Islamic insurgencies. The same for Mozambique in the north. And the United States and its North Atlantic allies, particularly France, are allied with Gulf Arab states that oftentimes are directly or indirectly funneling supplies and cash to these religious zealots as part of a larger scheme. And the prime battlefield in that regard right now is the Sudan, a portion of which is descending into famine. There's also been kind of mass slaughter taking place in the United Arab Emirates in particular, which I've singled out more than once on these airwaves, has been largely responsible, or I should say significantly responsible, for this horror that's taking place. Whereas if you look at Russia, on its own soil, it's dealing with religious zealotry. Look at the history of Chechnya, for example, which was a bleeding sore once Mr. Putin came into office circa 1999, circa 2000. And so Russia has a material interest in arresting the spread of this kind of religious zealotry, whereas the North Atlantic nations are involved in a conflict of interest. It's very simple. It doesn't take a soothsayer or an oracle or a seer to analyze that particular question.
Didn't Minister Farrakhan and Mike Tyson visit Chechnya and come away advocating that we, not just we, but African people in America and oppressed people around the world should support Chechnya? Am I wrong in saying it? Is my history right, or am I missing something?
Well, I don't actually recall that, but it would not surprise me if that were the case. Because, of course, they oftentimes feel the need to be in solidarity with those they consider to be their fellow co-religionists. So my answer is I'm not sure.
I'll look into that, send you some stuff, and maybe we can talk about it next week. Melinda Francis, what's next?
Yeah, we have to go to the Japan, South Korea PRC summit.
Well, that was very significant. It's evidentiary of the fact that these two leading capitalist nations, speaking of Japan and South Korea, are hedging with regard to the new Cold War with China, the fact that they met at the highest level with the Chinese leadership. I should also mention in this context that there was an important South Korea-Africa summit that took place in this past week. And a key attendee was President Mnangagwa of Zimbabwe. Now, it's no secret why South Korea would like to curry favor with Africa, or with Zimbabwe in particular, since Zimbabwe is a repository and a storehouse of natural resources essential for the emerging green economy, particularly lithium. Interestingly enough, Mr. Mnangagwa, after landing in South Korea and communing with the folks there, then took off for the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum in Russia, where he communed with President Putin. This should lead us, I think, to a further comment on the aftermath of the South African elections, because the right-wing Democratic Alliance used the fate and plight of Zimbabwe as a cudgel through which to flay their African opponents. The Democratic Alliance, of course, is a neo-apartheid party, heavily comprised of descendants of the settlers. They tried to attract Black leaders, mostly in vain, because they cannot stomach the rank racism of the Democratic Alliance. Although, in light of the fact that the ANC majority has collapsed, the ANC is being counseled, from this side of the Atlantic at least, to enter a coalition government with the Democratic Alliance. If that were to happen, it will cause enormous rancor and rifts within the ANC, and the fact that we cannot rule that out as of this moment is quite telling and quite unfortunate. I should also say that if the ANC does not enter into an alliance with the Democratic Alliance, it's possible that they will enter into a coalition government with the economic freedom fighters under Julius Malema, who received 9, 10, 11% of the vote, and combined with the 40% of the ANC, that gets them over the 50% hump. The MK party of President Zuma got 14, 15, 16% of the vote, but has pledged not to enter into a coalition with the ANC as long as President Cyril Ramaphosa remains as the leader of the ANC. I should also mention that it's ironic that the MK party and Mr. Zuma have been a beneficiary of this vote, because in some ways, Mr. Zuma is like the poacher and the gamekeeper. He's like the arsonist and the firefighter. What I mean is that he helped to create this crisis for South Africa through his sticky fingers and through the fact of cronyism and looting the treasury. Don't believe me on that. Look at the Zondo Commission report, ZONDO, and the report of Judge Nugent in South Africa, which talked about how the Zuma forces were actually looting what is the equivalent in the United States of the Internal Revenue Service, leaving the state with hardly any money. I mean, it's quite an incredible story. And President Mbeki, former President Mbeki, who was supplanted by Zuma circa 2008, allowing Zuma to serve about 10 years, in recent interviews has been stressing this point. And of course, Mr. Mbeki is too much of a diplomat and perhaps even a politician to say, "I told you so." That is to say, to wag the finger at the comrades who replaced him with Jacob Zuma, which led to the decline of the ANC majority. But that's basically what he's saying in so many words, even though he will not articulate it. And I should also mention that in 2021, as a result of all of these criminal charges that Jacob Zuma was facing, that in Durban, on the Indian Ocean coast, he and his comrades, or I should say his comrades, led a January 6th style insurrection leading to the most significant bout of violence, mass violence in South Africa since apartheid. Almost 400 people were killed within a matter of a day or two. It was quite remarkable. And so one of the things I've been stressing on in my analyses of the South African election is that the comrades in the ANC and the South African Communist Party who put Jacob Zuma into office, they really need to come clean. They really need to do a full assessment of how and why that happened. Now, I know that at the time people were saying that Zulus were underrepresented, but that's not enough, it seems to me. And speaking of the Zulu question, I find it very curious that certain Black Americans who, at least ostensibly, rail against what they call tribalism and ethnic difference in favor of an overarching Blackness and Black identity and African identity, many of them have jumped aboard the Zuma train, which is quite curious, since Zuma is a Zulu ethno-chauvinist. I mean, I don't know how to explain that. I guess it's because they're so hostile to the ANC, perhaps because of anti-communism, which is something that we have not explored sufficiently in our community. But it's really a head scratcher. It's quite baffling in retrospect.
What was the brother? Remember the brother that used to have a record store across the street from the Apollo Theater, who was a Zulu? He was an ANC member, but he used to refer to himself as a Zulu American. Tall brother, about 6'8". Oh my goodness, I can't think of his name right now. I used to see him all. He was close to Ilombe and had a very deep voice, like Paul Robeson, Melvin Franklin type of voice. He had a record store right across the street from the Apollo Theater where he sold all R&B and calypso, and you know what I'm talking about. But I know you know him. But
the chap that you're referring to. In fact, I guess the statute of limitations has expired. And certainly the technology has expired, because it was an open secret back in the day that if you needed a well-functioning IBM Selectric typewriter that was brand spanking new at a cut rate price, that was the place to go. And I know many who took advantage of that. I assume he's back in South Africa now. I assume he's alive and well. And I assume that he did not defect to Zuma's MK party.
And he was he was very close to Ilombe and to Preston Wilcock, and he was close. The radical left, all the tendencies. Everybody related to him because I guess he had those resources, and he was well spoken, and he defended South Africa, and he defended African people and oppressed people very well.
Mm-hmm.
Very well. Could we talk about? Go ahead, Melinda. Sorry.
No, I was just saying we should. We still have a little bit more stuff to go through. Do you want to go to the Mexican and the European Parliament elections?
Yeah, very important elections, and I'm glad that you raised that because Claudia Sheinbaum, the successor to AMLO, Manuel Lopez Obrador, as the leader of Mexico, made history not only in becoming the first the first woman president, but also the first Jewish president. Because there hangs a tale, because, I've written at length about Mexico, and before the 20th century, Mexico, as befitting a nation that was invaded by the Spanish in 1519, when the Spanish were in the midst of the Inquisition. The Inquisition meaning, amongst other things, that if you were Jewish, you either had to convert to Catholicism or be tortured or executed. And so there was more than an iota of anti-Jewish fervor in Mexico for the longest. And in some ways, it's equivalent to the election of a first Black president in the United States of America. And she's a very intelligent president, is a partial winner of a Nobel Prize because of her work in energy engineering. And she has a very difficult record to assemble because relations with the United States are complicated by the fact that Mr. Biden is capitulating to the anti-immigrant ethos of Mr. Trump with regard to closing down the border, with regard to asylum. And of course, Mexico's relations with China are escalating. In fact, by some measures, Laredo, Texas, on the border, is one of the most significant ports in all of the world, which is something new, but it has a lot to do with China transshipping goods from its homeland to Mexico, where they slap a made in Mexico label on it and then ship it across the border from Laredo into the United States and Canada. Now, the European Parliament elections are taking place as we speak. The right wing is expected to do quite well, I'm afraid to say. And in light of the fact that Indian elections also were concluded with a stinging blow to the Hindu chauvinism of Prime Minister Modi, you would not be out of line to sketch a growing division on planet Earth, where you see that in the global South, or in the global majority, you see perhaps a shift to the left if you look at India, if you look at Mexico, and even to a degree South Africa, because of course, if you combine the totals of the ANC and the EFF, in particular, as noted, that's 50% plus. And if you consider the MK party as being a party of the left, in light of the fact that they're calling for expropriation of the commanding heights of the economy, that adds 15% to that particular majority. Whereas in the global north, so-called, you see this turn to the right, where in the United States, I don't think I'm talking out of school to suggest that the Trump forces, irrespective of who gets the most votes, they're going to claim victory. And then they're going to cement that victory in the streets, like they tried to do on January 6, 2021. So much for the United States being this hallmark of democratic praxis, as many of our liberal friends have tried to instruct us. In any case, the way to explicate this seeming contradiction between the global majority and the global north, so-called, is that the latter I'm afraid to say, may be coming back to the pack. That is to say that the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, they now outstrip in terms of the size of the economy the G7 nations, the United States, Western European nations, plus Japan. And with Thailand joining the BRICS just this past week, which got little or no publicity in North America, and with the perhaps ascension to the BRICS of Indonesia and Algeria this year, we are in the midst of a Copernican shift in the global correlation of forces, the likes of which we have not seen in at least 500 years.
I never heard about the Thailands. This is the first time I am hearing about Thailand and BRICS. Very first time.
Well, I heard it on this program that I monitor, and I would recommend it into our audience, called Inside China Business, which you can find on YouTube. The segments are only 5 or 6 minutes long. They're very brief, but very meaty, and I recommend this program. And to give you an idea of which way the winds are blowing, the host is this Yankee who lives in China, who is not very progressive, but as a sign of the times, I think that, like many, he wants to be on the winning side. He wants to make money, and so he's in China. And so you can expect more of that. As a matter of fact, you might want to tell some of your Black American friends about that, because I know they want to make money too.
Yes, yes, sir. Yes, nothing wrong with making money, but it's what you're going to do with the money and who you're going to support with that money. Is there anything else you'd like to add, sir?
Well, I think that our time is up.
All right, then we've been listening to Diasporic.